Hello and welcome to our live webcast, Supplier-Centric Sourcing. Thanks for joining us. My name is Kurt and I'll be the operator for the presentation today. We are joined today by our speaker, Richard Waugh, Vice President Corporate Development at Zycus. Richard, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks so much, Kurt. My pleasure to join you today and our audience for our discussion of the webinar topic, Supplier-Centric Sourcing. And just before I preview for our attendees the agenda for today, a little bit of background context about Zycus. At Zycus, we provide an integrated suite of source-to-pay software modules that span sourcing and procurement processes. So tools for spend analytics, e-sourcing, contract management, procure-to-pay, financial savings management, and an area that we'll focus on in particular today, supplier management. After all, suppliers are the guests of honor or the topic for our discussion today. And our position in the market, well established through third-party credentials such as Gartner Magic Quadrant that looks at suite vendors in the space and positions Zycus as a leader in the most recent Magic Quadrant report. So with that said, I wanted to talk about the agenda for today. And the topic is supplier-centric sourcing. And I think so oftentimes procurement takes a very category-centric view. Of course, category management, a well-established discipline, or in some cases more of a process orientation. Both very valid approaches and methodologies and so on. But for today, really wanted to take that supplier-centric view of the world. Let's not forget that you can't have procurement without the buy and the sell side of the relationship as well. It takes a supplier to make the whole enterprise function. And so for today's agenda, I wanted to drill down into distinct areas and disciplines within supplier management, starting with the very initial gathering of supplier information and onboarding of suppliers. Once those suppliers are in the fold, so to speak, what are the methodologies and disciplines for effectively measuring supplier performance? And not only supplier performance, but also assessing and mitigating potential of supplier risk. What are the strategies for supplier risk management? And we'll also deal with how can you most effectively enable suppliers, not just from a process standpoint, but also to take advantage of the latest enabling technologies that make that collaboration with your supply base more effective, more beneficial in reality for both parties. So a lot of ground to cover, and as we go through, I wanted to share some of the benchmarks, some of the best practices, and some case examples, case studies that highlight how best-of-breed, best-in-class organizations are utilizing best practices in each of these various domains and disciplines. So, best place to start is always at the beginning. We're going to start with how do we gather supplier information and get suppliers onboarded from the outset. And just to scope or frame the magnitude of the challenge, I think it's helpful to look at what is the domain, what is the universe of suppliers that most organizations are engaging and interacting with. And that in and of itself poses some pretty daunting challenges. So here's some data from the Hackett Group where they looked at a variety of companies across industries and sort of normalized data and said, how many suppliers does a typical organization have per $1 billion of total spend? And here the discrepancy between sort of the average organization, what's referred to as the peer group, and top performing organizations is so dramatic and so distinct. So per billion in spend, average organizations have 5 times as many suppliers that they have to engage and manage as compared to top performing organizations. So over 10,000 for the average organization, less than 2,500 for top performing organizations. And not only do the top performers have fewer suppliers because they've rationalized the supply base effectively, in their supplier master, in their ERP systems, those supplier records are more likely to be active records. So part of the proliferation that the average organization sees in their sheer supplier count is the fact that somewhere in that supplier master are mixed in significant percentage that are actually inactive or redundant suppliers, duplicative, as compared to a much cleaner vendor master file that the top performers can actually point to in their case. And one of the benefits of rationalizing that supply base down is also seen in terms of the spend rationalization and consolidation. So top performers have only about half as many suppliers that actually comprise 80% of their volume. So 4.5% of suppliers in the top performer category actually account for 80% of the spend volume, almost double that amount, about 8% for the peer group. So just at the very outset, clear that the ability to rationalize, cleanse the supplier master, and consolidate the supply base makes the magnitude of the challenge that much easier, still significant even for top performing organizations, but simply reducing the size of the supply base is going to make the task at hand that much easier in terms of how you're going to keep track of these suppliers, gather all the requisite information, and do a better job of monitoring their performance. So let's talk a little bit about the types of supplier information that needs to be gathered. This data, again, comes from the Hackett Group, and they've looked at, in this matrix type of depiction, the type of information, both in terms of the importance of that information, as well as their relative satisfaction with their ability to gather it and analyze the information. So with those parameters in mind, satisfaction levels are typically much higher with data sources that tend to be the most readily available. So at the top here, general company information, addresses, contact information, those kinds of things. Other information that's also more likely to be publicly available, such as ownership structure, and either through public or third-party data sources, information around financial performance, as an example. As we move down the pyramid, so to speak, though, the satisfaction levels degrade as we look at those types of information that actually require more analysis and verification. So when it gets into actual performance by the suppliers, or the ability to verify compliance information like the diversity data, insurance certificates, safety or quality certifications, a much lower satisfaction in that area. We also noticed that there are significant challenges for global enterprises gathering and maintaining country-specific data. So it's not just to have, not enough to have one global or monolithic view of a supplier. Especially the top suppliers may be providing products and services across the globe, and the ability to capture that information at a more granular and finite level is posing to be particularly challenging for a number of organizations. And sort of some of the lowest satisfaction, lower importance to be sure, but lower satisfaction is also seen in the areas of being able to capture more unstructured data, news feeds that would give indications of potential movements in the supply base, M&A activity, for example, or geopolitical events that can also be important for supplier risk assessment and measurement, more challenging for the typical organization to incorporate those types of supplier information. So obviously varied data sources, and significantly challenging, not just given the numbers of suppliers to be managed, but the fact that these data types typically reside in disparate systems or disparate sources. So let's talk then about supplier onboarding, the process by which I need to gather all this information and go through a vetting process, getting suppliers approved and onboarded. First, let's talk about who's responsible. Here's some information that comes from the AP network that actually indicates that most often accounts payable is tasked with gathering the information to get a supplier onboarded. Now, not surprisingly, because this responsibility falls to the accounts payable function about 2/3 of the time, oftentimes that means that the information being captured is primarily focused on the minimum amount of information required to get an invoice paid through accounts payable. What is the supplier ID, which in some cases the parent-child information, W-9s, and those kinds of things. Not always inclusive of the universe of information that we just talked about, a variety of performance, quality, and other types of information relative to the overall supplier relationship. Of course, accounts payable is not exclusively responsible. Oftentimes, procurement or purchasing is involved, or there's a discrete vendor management group within the organization as well. So the responsibility may often be shared, but usually with AP in a lead role. So what kind of information are they gathering? What type of vetting is most often done? Here's some data from Hackett's study that says most commonly organizations are capturing a W-9, critical for the AP process, of course. They're oftentimes validating supplier information using a tax ID number, a DUNS number, again, to get that supplier set up to be able to process their invoice. A significant percentage, 62% of organizations, are going through a management sign-off process to validate and verify the supplier information before that supplier is added to the vendor master file. Less frequently is the use of third-party services or data sources to actually independently validate or verify that information. So a variety of methods, different levels of vigor. Would be hard to call this extreme vetting, but oftentimes sort of what's the minimum needed to gather enough information to pay an invoice. So the process itself for onboarding suppliers, here's a diagram that shows a typical scenario that's time-consuming and that requires extensive stakeholder collaboration and interaction. Naturally, the starting point is with the suppliers, but often on point for this process is a category or commodity manager. In procurement, supplier relationship manager that really owns that supplier relationship, but they often need to collaborate and engage a variety of other internal stakeholders to complete that supplier onboarding and vetting process. So they may be folks in the financial or legal realm, or they may be from the compliance office or quality that review specific capabilities and certifications of suppliers to make sure that you're doing business with someone who has the capabilities necessary to satisfy the organization's requirements. So clearly a lot of different handoffs and touch points, often much more involved for direct material suppliers, especially things like on-site visits and quality certifications, but oftentimes many of the strategic indirect suppliers would go through this type of onboarding and vetting process as well. So lots of different coordination touch points, and unfortunately for most organizations, many of these processes today are highly manual or limited in their ability as many organizations attempt to deal with this through the supplier or vendor master in ERP, which often has a limited view of that relationship. As I said, most often the minimal information required to get the invoice paid through accounts payable. So lots of room for improvement in many organizations, and especially opportunities for efficiencies through automation. So supplier information management technology as a way to streamline and automate this process has significant potential for most organizations, but one of the things that they struggle with is, how do I frame the business case to invest in this technology? It tends to be a little bit more intangible than simply looking at purchase price variance savings on sourcing tools or those kinds of things. So helpful here is some data that comes from a Spend Matters study about creating a hard dollar business case for supplier management. So the benchmark data that they've captured suggests that on a cross-functional basis, as you include all those different stakeholders and the time that they have to spend in the process, on a per supplier basis, the cost range somewhere between $150 to $225 per supplier per year. Now, a fairly conservative assessment of the potential savings gained through automation, especially through supplier portal technology that offloads more of that effort to the suppliers themselves, allowing them to register through the portal, upload their own profile of information, and keep up-to-date certificates of insurance, W-9s, et cetera. That really can significantly reduce the level of effort, and the assumption here is on the order of about 20%. So that equates to an average savings of somewhere between $30 to $40 per supplier per year by introducing supplier information management tools and technologies, by automating this process, especially utilizing portal-based technology. So extrapolating that over a typical, as we said, the average company has about 10,000 suppliers per billion in spend. Well, that would equate to a savings on the order of $300,000 to $400,000 per year. So no trivial matter when it comes to the potential benefits to be gained by investing in supplier information management technology. So share with you quickly then a case study of a very large Fortune 500 oil and gas company that did exactly that, invested in supplier information management technologies after a number of attempts trying to utilize the incumbent ERP and finding that it was too limited to really enable what in this case was a highly sophisticated, complex workflow process, especially in the oil and gas industry, highly regulated, a very extensive scope. So in their case, 50,000 suppliers, over 1,000 internal users or stakeholders that were involved in the onboarding process, and taking an extremely complex onboarding workflow to consolidate and rationalize really thousands of different workflows with complex conditional logic that could contain up to 20 to 30 steps. So not everyone's onboarding process would involve as many steps, in this case, especially due to the regulatory nature of the business. But the opportunity here is with a flexible, configurable capability to standardize those workflows, to eliminate the manual handoffs and touch points, and in the process, really gain true visibility. So in this case, sort of a 360-degree view into specific regulatory requirements such as child labor restrictions and regulations, environmental standards, keeping up to date with minority and women-owned business qualifications, as well as more of the green and sustainability initiatives around the carbon footprint or conflict minerals compliance standards of the supply base. So highly successful case example there in a very complex environment for onboarding a large scale of suppliers. So I want to talk next about the discipline of supplier performance management. What are the key performance indicators that are typically involved in rating and assessing supplier performance? So here's some data that comes from CAPS, the Center for Advanced Purchasing Studies, specific to the industrial manufacturing industry, and it finds that the most often used key performance indicators or metrics are on-time delivery, total cost of ownership, quality as measured in parts per million. Almost universally, 100% of the companies in that benchmark study utilize those measures nearly as often. They're also looking at what is that supplier's capacity and their responsiveness, their ability to flex that capacity according to my demand as a critical customer. And nearly as frequently looking at things like what is the level of innovation that this supplier brings to the table that can not only lead to cost productivity, but also more and more frequently top-line revenue improvement. Can the supplier bring to the table new technologies, new products, or help me enter new markets that can drive innovation through top-line revenue enhancement as well? Certainly quality considerations, risk mitigation, as well as that tier one supplier's ability to effectively manage the sub-tiers of the supply chain on my behalf as well. So a variety of key performance indicators that are typically used in the supplier performance management discipline. And in terms of the frequency with which that's done, really key that more organizations are doing, at least annual, if not quarterly or monthly, assessments of supplier performance. Obviously, the more frequently those are done, the more opportunity there is to remediate any performance that tends to lag behind the targeted or established performance levels. So I wanted to go through a case study example, this one from AMD, Advanced Micro Devices in the high-tech space, that's focused really significantly into this area of supplier performance management. Here's a quote from the director there that talks about the fact that at AMD, collaboration has been at the forefront of their strategy, that working with and rewarding suppliers to bring their best ideas becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, that doing a better job of collaborating with those suppliers around supplier performance measurement produces more innovation from those suppliers, more value, and in the process allows those suppliers the opportunity to differentiate themselves on other attributes beyond simply cost productivity. So the starting point for AMD was having to try to do this originally with a variety of homegrown tools, really led to low adoption due to a fairly manual, cumbersome process, meaning they were able to only measure fewer suppliers less frequently, and by automating the solution, we're able to significantly increase the adoption rate, drive greater value with a more robust assessment of supplier performance, as well as be able to document improvement plans or corrective action plans in those cases where performance fell below the targeted levels. So really being able to engage the variety of stakeholders as well as engaging the suppliers themselves in a truly collaborative and constructive kind of a feedback process really delivered dramatic results for AMD. And just to share a little bit about how they went about it, segmentation is key to this whole approach. Whether you're the average organization that has 10,000 suppliers per billion in spend, or you have more like 2,400 and you're a top performer, in any case, you still really wouldn't be able to effectively measure performance across all of your suppliers, the whole universe. So it's really key to then segment the supply base in order to prioritize those suppliers that you're going to focus most on. So in the case of AMD, they have a 3-tier approach. The top tier, of course, are the most strategic suppliers, the middle tier being transformational, with whom their business may be growing, and therefore the assessment is really key to see, can we move forward with this supplier? Will they be a source of innovation? How do we maybe move them into the top tier strategic category? And of course, at the bottom tier are more transactional or operational relationships, pure commodities, really not an opportunity necessarily for the type of strategic innovation type relationships, but still important to categorize them appropriately and deal with them as such. So in the case of AMD, they actually apply this rigor on an annualized basis. So I think that's really a key here, that recognize that the supply base is not static, that suppliers could move from one tier to the next on an annual basis. So on an ongoing, repetitive basis once a year, going through the segmentation process with the global commodity teams to make sure that they assign the correct category or segment, and really making sure that that segmentation analysis starts with spend analytics, really being able to understand the nature of that business relationship, how much goods or services are we purchasing from this vendor, how is that profile changing over time, but then augmenting the spend data visibility with key scorecard criteria, including risk, value delivered to the business, the type of collaborative relationship being established with the supplier, and corporate social responsibility measured and factored into the measurement as well. So a very rigorous methodology, successfully implemented and enhanced by the use of state-of-the-art automation tools for supplier performance management. The scorecards themselves are then produced more frequently for the strategic suppliers, quarterly scorecards, whereas the Tier 2 transformational suppliers would be assessed on a semi-annual basis. And the KPIs cover 5 key focus areas: technology, quality, cost, flexibility, and service. So some of the keys around the best practices that they've realized at AMD are, first, that this is a very transparent and open process. So going through an annual segmentation, they also go through an annual process of reviewing and updating the key performance indicators and sharing that information with the suppliers. So very important that the suppliers know what are the criteria that we're going to be judged on and assessed by, so that they can be proactive in how they manage to meet those key performance indicators. The other thing is that the KPIs themselves, consistency is very important, but they do vary from category to category. And in some cases, they may not include all of the key 5 focus areas. But within a category, they are consistent, so that like suppliers that provide the same category of product or service are going to be consistently assessed against the same rubric, if you will, the same parameters or KPIs within that category-based scorecard. And I think the thing that suppliers value most here is that this type of a holistic view that takes into account total cost of ownership, that looks at the nature of the collaboration and the relationship, the innovation that the supplier brings to the table, allows the suppliers to differentiate on service level. So it's not all just about price. The other key takeaway that AMD found in this case is that by engaging not just the suppliers, but their stakeholders and business partners in collaborative review process really helps differentiate procurement as a function to those different constituencies. To the internal stakeholders, procurement is a true business partner, not just focused on cost reduction, but really helping them achieve their business goals by having this type of a holistic view of that supplier relationship. And for the suppliers themselves, this is really a way to differentiate the procurement function and the business as a customer of choice to those suppliers, because let's face it, not all customers are engaging them on this level of collaboration and valuing their ideas and contributions. So, lots of best practices to take away for anyone considering implementing or enhancing and extending an existing supplier performance management by blending these best practices along with best-in-class technologies. I want to talk a little bit then about supplier risk management as well. Some helpful benchmark data, I think, in this case, and pretty revealing. I think when it comes to supplier risk management, the level to which you're focused on this to a large extent will be reflected in the resources that are allocated to this task. So looking in the upper left-hand quadrant here is some data from Hackett that I think is, again, pretty revealing. So top-performing procurement organizations have fewer staff overall than the average performers. They've introduced automation. They're able to do more with less. But significantly, when it comes to the specific domain of supplier risk management, have invested more organizational resources, 6.5 times more FTEs, to supplier risk management as compared to their counterparts in the median or bottom quartile. So the top quartile performers allocate about 13 FTEs, full-time equivalents, specifically to supplier risk management. Now, another data point I'd like to share with you seems to be a bit of an anomaly. This one comes from Ardent Partners that said that best in class, the top performing procurement organizations actually have a higher percentage of their supply base that they would categorize as high risk, 8.4%, as compared to just average performing procurement organizations at just below 6%. That they would classify as high risk. Now again, that seems to be an anomaly. Do top-performing organizations actually onboard and engage riskier suppliers than their average performing counterparts? I doubt that's actually the case. I think what this really points to is the fact that those top performers are more focused on supplier risk. They're devoting more resources to the task. So they're just actually doing a better job of identifying potential sources of supply risk, which implies that they can therefore do a better job in mitigating that supply risk as well. So another key measure around risk is how often and to what universe of suppliers do you perform effective supplier risk assessments? So here's Hackett Group data that suggests that nearly 70% of organizations perform annual or more frequent supplier risk assessments. And on average, those supplier risk assessments are performed for relationships with individual suppliers that generate 500,000 or more in spend on an annual basis. But that's the average. The top performers are actually encapsulating, incorporating a much broader base of their suppliers. So at a minimum threshold for the top performers of just 10,000 in annual spend, that would trigger at least an annual supplier risk assessment. And on average, those assessments take about 4 days to complete. So what should be included in a supplier risk assessment? This is just a checklist that kind of looks at the variety of areas to screen for whether those are sort of on an enterprise or corporate-wide basis, first checking it against a government watch list like the OFAC list to make sure that you're not doing business with suppliers that would be blacklisted based on a government regulation. And as well as sort of covering the basics, certificates of insurance, W-9s, W-8s, validations or verifications of disadvantaged business status. But various functional groups, various domains then have additional requirements. In the legal area, you're looking at bankruptcies and liens and corporate records, health and safety in the area of things like OSHA, increasingly on a global basis, regulatory restrictions around conflict minerals, REACH and RoHS, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act as an example. So just a helpful checklist as to what types of information need to be screened for in supplier risk assessment. And here again, I wanted to share a brief case study. This one comes from QBE Insurance, an Australian-based company with global operations that cover, from a procurement standpoint, disciplines and claims, indirect, and IT as an example. And challenges that they face from a supplier management standpoint, probably typical for a lot of organizations in that, not really being able to fully embed and assess risk in the supplier selection process without technology, having a very inefficient process to begin with, and that leads to inconsistently applied risk and financial assessments, some cases performed well, other cases not performed at all, and overall it leads to a reactive process not integrated with other process functions around sourcing and contracting or other functional organizations across the business. So clearly some challenges going in, and the vision was to develop a rigorous supplier segmentation and risk assessment process to be able to first segment the supply base and determine which suppliers present the most risk, and then determine based on that initial assessment which ones to perform detailed supplier performance and quality and risk assessments with, and devote significantly more relationship management resources to engage with that supplier and manage the process on an ongoing basis. And of course, enabling this through technology to increase visibility, ease of use, and create a holistic view of the suppliers. And from a process integration standpoint, that means integrating supplier risk at the very outset of the category management process. So define the business needs, establish those KPIs in going through the strategic sourcing and supplier selection process, codify those through the contracting phase. Make sure that the suppliers are signing up to those critical KPIs and capabilities that you want to measure on an ongoing basis through the supplier management discipline. So, transforming the process meant starting with segmentation, performing those initial risk assessments, doing a deep dive around risk management with questionnaires and financial analysis and scorecards for those suppliers in those segments that are deemed to be the most critical to monitor and measure, and then providing the ongoing performance and relationship management. So just to give you a sense of how they went about doing that, first of all, they're utilizing scorecarding technology to be able to first create an internal assessment of those suppliers to determine what category they fit in. So by applying those scores and a variety of formulas, calculation formulas, they were able to determine a segment based on the scores that resulted. So those suppliers that fit into the higher risk profile segments would then receive additional levels of screening around 5 key areas. So risk was assessed in finance, in legal, reputational risk, operational and strategic risk, and those suppliers would then be engaged through an online survey process in much more detailed questionnaires and analytics, and then the outputs become assessed and specific action plans identified for those scores that were outside of established thresholds to be able to proactively mitigate and measure and monitor risk. So, the last area I wanted to cover will be supplier enablement. And again, we want to take a look at the supplier's view of the world. What are the unique challenges that your suppliers face to be able to effectively collaborate with you, be a strong partner in your enterprise? And the suppliers themselves actually face quite a magnitude of challenges. To give you a little bit of the backstory, let's say, suppliers are suffering from a malady that we'll call portal fatigue. So these portal technologies are a great new breakthrough, but they do pose challenges to suppliers. They may be asked to get onboarded and enabled with a variety of different portals, not just from different technology providers, but even within a given customer account, those organizations may be using different portal interfaces, one for RFPs and the sourcing process, one for contracts when it comes to putting those agreements in place, still another when it comes to onboarding the suppliers or engaging in transactional document exchange around procure-to-pay process, for example. So one of the key enablers to simplifying life for your suppliers is to give them a single portal interface. Make sure there are no barriers to entry for participation on their side, meaning no fees of any kind to the suppliers. Allow them to log in once and enter data once and have that consistent standard approach and data be proliferated across a range of collaboration activities, not just with you, but with any of the other customers that they want to engage with through this portal. So the range of activities you see here, the supplier in the center, but they may be first asked to self-register through a portal, so upload their registration, profile information, and not only provision and upload things like certificates of insurance or W-9s, but then keep them up to date on an ongoing basis as they come up for renewal or expiry or things change. So more and more buying organizations are asking suppliers through a self-service portal interface to do more of this work on their behalf. And if they're engaged in a transactional type relationship, to load or update and maintain catalog information, to be able to confirm PO receipt, acknowledge POs, and also flip that PO into an invoice back to the buying organization and create other types of turnaround documents like advance ship notice to give the buying organization a preview as to when to expect delivery. They're also being asked to engage around those supplier scorecards in the supplier performance management area that we just mentioned, as well as responding to requests for proposal or engaging in contract negotiations. So a variety of collaboration challenges that can be made easier by giving that supplier a single, easy-to-use portal interface, by providing the onboarding support, and certainly by not imposing any fees to the suppliers to participate. So to give you a sense of the magnitude of the supplier enablement challenge, here's some benchmark data that comes from Hackett that says to onboard an individual supplier typically costs the organization just under $1,000 per supplier. So again, extrapolate that over the number of suppliers that you have to onboard, and it can be a significant cost. So one area where third-party solutions, especially cloud-based solutions, to provide more of that supplier outreach and onboarding can have a cost productivity benefit to the organization. The time to onboard suppliers, typically about 16 days elapsed and 17 days of applied time. Now, interestingly, when organizations that have been through this process were asked to say, what are the top challenges from an enablement standpoint specific to e-invoicing, the less frequent responses were that the technology is hard to use or integration is a problem. So the technology in and of itself is not baffling to suppliers. In fact, the most often cited challenge by almost 2/3 was the potential of incurring additional fees on behalf of the suppliers was a much more vexing and daunting challenge than the technology in and of itself. So when we look at how are organizations collaborating, connecting with their supply base, no surprise that top-performing organizations are much more likely to be using advanced connection methods. So direct connects through supplier portals or value-added networks such as electronic data interchange with a value-added network, or third-party networks for enterprise invoice presentment and payment as an example. So the majority of the time, 52% of the time, those connections are established through advanced methods as opposed to the average performers that are using more manual email or paper-based types of methods of collaborating with suppliers. And top performers are more likely to be delivering electronic POs better than 2/3 of the time for top performers, electronic payments 80% of the time, and to be able to get back electronic invoices 70% of the time for top performers. Contrast that with the average performers that from an invoicing standpoint, fewer than 1 in 5, less than 20% of their invoice volume is coming through electronically. So really important from a supplier enablement standpoint to speak to the suppliers themselves and have a value proposition that it contains at least, I would say, equal measures of carrots and sticks. So from the enticement side, what's in it for the suppliers? First of all, removing any barriers to entry, not having any cost to participate, but also allowing those suppliers to utilize whatever technology they're comfortable and capable with. So top-tier suppliers, connecting with them in a fully machine-to-machine integration approach using standard protocols like XML or EDI, but for mid-tier suppliers, enabling them to connect simply through a browser interface to a portal. Offering inducements or enticements like giving the suppliers visibility to their invoice and payment status, or collaborating around scorecards, those kinds of things. Also enabling them for early pay discounts so that they can improve their working capital position while you save money in the process. Now, many organizations find that in addition to the carrots, they may need a couple of sticks along the way. So many organizations simply state that this is a mandate and there's some lead time for compliance and getting on board, and there may be assistance from the technology provider to help with the onboarding and enablement process, that hand-holding that goes along with it. But by a certain date, this is going to be a condition of doing business. It's going to be required. In fact, many organizations are including the requirements for electronic collaboration right up front in the sourcing process. So supplier participation is included in the RFP process. It's baked into contract terms and conditions, and often included as one of those key performance indicators in the ongoing scorecard assessment of suppliers, so that those that avail themselves of the technology to collaborate electronically receive a higher performance rating than the suppliers that are dragging their feet. So really critical from an enablement standpoint, once again, to utilize a segmentation approach and really identify those top-tier suppliers. Often it's the 80-20 rule in effect, where 20% of suppliers may actually comprise 80% of the transaction volumes. And that often, therefore, focuses efforts usually on the top 2 tiers of suppliers. Top tier that are e-commerce enabled to put in place a machine-based data integration using standard protocols like CXML, or suppliers that can utilize the web-based portals to do, with a browser-based access, things like a PO flip to convert a PO to an invoice. Those are the ones that are going to get the biggest bang for the buck the fastest and are often prioritized in initial onboarding. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, a supplier would come to a portal, log in with the username and password, and in one place be able to see all of their different interactions with you as a buying customer. So if you've asked them to comment on a scorecard, to respond to an RFP, to confirm and acknowledge your PO, or to send you back an electronic invoice, all of that information is available to a supplier from a dashboard view and enables them to quickly drill into things like, maybe I just want to see what's my current invoice status, and has the buying organization, my customer, received my invoice? Is it in the approval queue? Has it been scheduled for payment? And even be able to see, check number and check date so that I can know when to expect that payment and plan my working capital needs accordingly. So I want to finish up today's discussion with, again, a case study example around this area of supplier enablement, and in particular around procure to pay, where it's so critical. This is a private insurance company that really faced a number of typical challenges in, as a starting point, a pretty manual, labor-intensive process. So different avenues available to end users to requisition and order goods, no one standard process for onboarding and maintaining supplier information, and some limited automation really on the back-end invoice payment process through the incumbent ERP, and really a clear need to establish standard workflow approval processes, true compliance around spending, and automate, take the paper out of the supplier enablement, onboarding, and invoice payment process to create a single version of the truth. Now, in their case, they rigorously applied this kind of 80-20 rule. So focus first on onboarding the 20% of suppliers, 500 or thereabouts, that constitute 80% of the volume. And in doing that, once again, the 80-20 rule applied. Of those suppliers enabled, 20% that generate the highest volumes were enabled using standard CXML protocols, 80% via the portal, and certainly a lot of education and training with the suppliers to communicate the carrots, what's in it for the program, but also a very firm stance that this would be a mandatory requirement for suppliers to participate. So the results included getting to go live ahead of schedule, full automation of the end-to-end P2P workflow and process, critical mass of suppliers enabled, as well as catalogs. And the benefits, dramatically shrinking cycle times, ordering processes that typically lasted several days to only a few hours, shrinking invoice approval cycle times down, taking full advantage of early payment discounts, actually netting over $100,000 just by eliminating duplicate payments from the AP process as well. So as a result, compliant processes, no PO, no pay, implemented, significant time and cost savings realized, and much happier stakeholders from a net promoter standpoint. Both internal stakeholders react favorably to a more automated, more collaborative process, and suppliers as well. So that's the final case study that I wanted to share today. I know we have lots of questions, but not much time to address those, but did want to try to pick up a couple of questions today before we close.
And to ask your questions, as many of you have, simply type your questions in the Q&A panel to the right of the slides. Those questions will be visible to our presenter so that he can address those. And we have just about 3 or 4 minutes remaining. And with that, I'll turn it quickly back to you, Richard, to address some of those questions.
Sure. And certainly we'll try to follow up after the webinar with any questions that we don't get to, because there simply isn't time to cover them all. But a lot of great questions. You know, what is spend for both direct and indirect included in these processes? Absolutely. Many practitioners will tell you that the level of rigor applied to direct material suppliers may be much more stringent than on the indirect side, but in those categories as well, more and more companies are really assessing supplier performance measurement with key indirect suppliers, especially in areas like IT, that can really directly translate to organizational competitiveness and innovation as well. So it's certainly not just for direct material suppliers by any stretch of the imagination. So a number of questions like that, also certainly around different vertical markets, industry by industry, these requirements are going to vary. So I think that the answer is yes, there are differences and nuances by industry. The key from a technology selection and deployment standpoint will be to what extent are those technologies flexible enough to really deal with the industry differences and nuances from one to the next. Some questions, of course, about does Zycus provide these types of software across the range of supplier management activities that I've been addressing. Yes, I wanted to focus on more around best practices and actual customer case experiences, but yes, the full range of software capabilities are included in the Zycus suite of capabilities as well.
And we still have about a minute remaining, so we'll look for another minute or so of questions.
Yeah, so one question that came in as well is about validation of suppliers, if that can be done through third parties. So it's an excellent question because I've been stressing the self-service nature of this portal technology, which is a critical component. If you're ever going to get out from under this overhead that most organizations experience in having to maintain the suppliers, really critical to be able to offload more of that work to the suppliers themselves. But that is a self-service provisioning of supplier information. So more and more of our customers certainly are looking to enhance the self-service nature of the technology itself with third-party validation solutions. So for instance, we enable through partners the ability to engage a third-party service to actually validate and verify that a supplier's certificate of insurance, for example, is not only is current and valid, but can drill into, on a country-by-country level, for example, that the levels of insurance coverage are as required and appropriate, just as an example. So another great question. Wish I could get to all of them, Kurt. Unfortunately, we can't today, but we'll certainly follow up via email with as many of the questions as possible.
All right, and with that, we have reached the end of our time together, and on behalf of the Institute for Supply Management and Zycus, I would like to thank you, our audience, for your participation in today's event. This concludes today's program. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.